Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here, as always. Today, we have Time magazine correspondent Simon Schuster and his book, The Showman, which is about Ukraine's President Zelensky. Now, I know, hey, before you hit pause, before you hit stop, I know there's a lot of stuff out there about Ukraine. There's a lot of opinions. Even when I first started to read the book, I'm kind of like, if I'm just going to read about a bunch of propaganda, I want nothing to do with it. The reason why I love this book is that, first of all, Simon was there for a lot of this stuff. He met Zelensky before the invasion. He has seen him afterwards. He has been on the ground for a lot of this stuff. And this book puts it right down the middle. All right, he doesn't make Zelensky out to be a saint. He doesn't make him out to be a villain. He sees him as a human in a crazy situation and how he has reacted. It's very much fair from what I see. It's factually based, and I liked it so much, I had to have him on. So I think you're going to really like this. I love this interview. We talked about a lot of interesting stuff. And for those of you who might say, hey, wait a second, isn't he the journalist that people were saying he works for the Russians? Yeah. Don't worry, I asked him that pretty much right away. So let's do it. And here we are with author and Time magazine correspondent Simon Schuster, the showman inside the invasion that shook the world and made a leader of Volodymyr Zelensky. Simon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Really an honor.
Simon, can I start off? This might be my most favorite first question of an episode ever. Are you a Russian asset?
I'd be a very strange one if I were. So no, I've been banned from entering Russia by the Russian authorities for, what is it now, about 9 years? They banned me in 2015 for my journalism. I got off easier than some of my other colleagues, like Evan Gershkovich, who is now in a Russian FSB prison in Moscow for, I think it's almost 300 days. So that happens to journalists now and then. The Russian authorities, never liked me very much. You know, when I hear that from some of my readers in Ukraine, I understand, emotions run high and this kind of thing. It comes with the territory of covering wars and conflicts where, you're dealing with really difficult issues. And I think, I've seen that accusation. It's a strange one, but I just as often get asked, I think, are you a Ukrainian asset, or how much are you Ukrainians paying you? I think as a journalist, that's kind of a sweet spot that you want to be in, where you're right in the middle, and it shows you're close, getting close to the ideal of objectivity if both sides make accusations against you or sling mud.
Well, I really appreciated finishing The Showman, and I remember picking my head up and thinking, if he's a Russian asset, he sucks at it. What I read from The Showman is this is a very big portrait of Zelensky, right? There's good parts, there's bad parts. He's human, he's all of these things, and you bring that out. The one person that you're not necessarily nice to would be Vladimir Putin, who, I don't think a lot of people are a fan of him specifically. But was that something that you were looking for, that you wanted to do this full portrait, kind of take away the politics and say, this is what happened and this is what I've seen?
Yeah, and that was, the expectation from, I think, President Zelensky and his staff. They knew me for years before the invasion started. They knew my work. My articles in the past, before the invasion, have often been critical of him. They've been critical of him during the invasion. They saw those articles coming out as we continued to work on the book. Sometimes they would express some annoyance about something I did. Sometimes I would even feel that they were kind of pushing me out a little bit after an article was published that wasn't in line with their narratives. But they understood who I am, what I do, and I have a great deal of respect for what it took to allow me to do this kind of fly-on-the-wall reporting. That was courageous. It showed a lot of trust in me, and also respect for the work of independent journalists. They just said, okay, yeah, you can hang out and talk to us, and we'll kind of tell you the story as it goes, as it unfolds around us. I think that's a good sign for where they are in terms of their respect for freedom of speech and the work of journalists. So just to compare and contrast, if you did this in Russia, you would most definitely be in jail. In Ukraine, they did not jail you. No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah, I mean, Putin, I hear you. Yeah, he comes off as a villain, I'd say, certainly, but also a bit of just a crazy person. Like, there's descriptions of the way he lives, the way he isolates himself in his villa on Lake Valdai there in Russia, the kind of cryogenic therapies that he does to try to stay young and sprightly. I try to depict Putin also as a human being, but he is just fundamentally a much weirder, darker personality. I've covered Putin for about 17 years since I began as a journalist in Moscow in 2006. He's also, I hope, a pretty fleshed out character in the book, but certainly because of the evils he's committed, comes off as quite a bit darker.
I mean, before we get into the actual book, you just talked about all this time you have spent in this area of the world, who you're writing on. How often are you legitimately scared, right? Because you are writing about people that are in areas where the rule of law may have kind of completely collapsed. Is it just it's another day at the office and you keep your head on a swivel, or is this something that kind of wears on you a bit?
There were definitely moments in this book when I was, scared for my safety. President Zelensky, one characteristic he has is a very high tolerance for risk and physical danger. So if you're following him around and spending time, with him, you have to be prepared for that. And there were certainly some hairy situations during the invasion, but also before the invasion, when we traveled in 2021 to the front lines of the war in the Donbass, as described in detail in the book. When I was like, man, do we really have to go over here? Like, this is very close to the Russian snipers that were just active here like a few days ago. Can we maybe take the advice of your bodyguards and kind of pull back a little bit? But that's part of the reporting. It was what you have to do. It was a bit scarier for me now as a family man. I have a wife and a child. In 2014, I was a bit more gung ho, and also had a higher tolerance for risk because I was, younger, on my own. Didn't have a family waiting for me back home. So back then, I did reporting in 2014, 2015 on both sides of the front and, got myself into some very, very sticky situations. But this reporting was fundamentally different. It was focused more on the high command in Kyiv. I mean, the vast majority of the time I spent reporting it was in Kyiv, in the presidential compound. So I wasn't running around the trenches nearly as much as in 2014.
I mean, but you saw some atrocities, though. You saw that there was a lot of kind of evidence around of some terrible things going on as well. That's right?
Yeah, I mean, everything, being in Kyiv in those early weeks and months was just horrific. You would see driving into town, driving out of town, there's just the wholesale destruction of a very vibrant, well-to-do suburbs of the capital, which was a very vibrant European city. I mean, it still is, but the damage that you saw was horrific. The destruction, the bombings, the missile attacks. And also, the one I describe in the book in most detail is Bucha. As one of Zelensky's advisors memorably put it, Bucha was the black swan that shook the world. Everyone heard the name Bucha, even though such atrocities have been reported and recorded in other liberated cities in Ukraine. Bucha was the one that really shocked the conscience of the world. I went there. I did see, the crime scenes that the Russian troops left behind, and that was difficult, but necessary to the reporting, and also necessary to understanding the main character, the main figure in this book, President Zelensky, because it shocked him so much to see Bucha. It was such a turning point for him in his fighting spirit and his war aims to see those atrocities up close. So I had to see them for myself as well and to understand them.
One of the most enlightening aspects of this book is I think a lot of people hear Zelensky and say, oh, yeah, the comedian. He was an actor and he became president. But you dive a lot deeper into that. Calling him just a comedian is really underselling it. He was almost kind of a Ukrainian media mogul, right?
That's fair enough. Yeah, I'd say he's one of the most, or if not the most successful showman, entertainer, showman in the broadest sense. So he was a producer, a comedian, a screenwriter, an actor, a dancer, a singer. He did it all, baby. He had an extremely successful production company called Studio Kvartal 95, named after the neighborhood where he grew up. It was cranking out, for years, cranking out all the biggest hits on Ukrainian TV and also Russian TV. So its audience spanned both countries for many years. And he was really the country's most famous satirist, political satire comedian, but just generally one of the most famous actors in the region. And those skills, as I argue in the book, came in very handy when the invasion started and when he became president. What I try to show in the book, over time, is that the skills that he had, the flexibility built into an actor's psyche to be able to take on new roles on the fly. If you remember, one of the things I describe in the book is that as a comedian early on, one of his specialties was improv comedy, where you're kind of put on the stage and given an idea and you have to sort of run with it and make it funny. That requires a certain kind of lightness on your feet. That he certainly developed over the years as an actor. And, when the invasion started, I argue that any person who would have done what he did, stay and fight, assume the role of a wartime leader, would have needed to have quite a bit of agility mentally, because nothing can prepare you. No career path prepares you for that. You have to change into that role no matter who you are. There's no one who's a sort of professional wartime president waiting in the wings to be called upon for an attack by a nuclear superpower next door. So I think the agility that he had as an actor, changing into different roles over the years, gave him a certain kind of strength and reserve of flexibility that came in handy when the invasion started.
And I don't want to underestimate what you said, which was that he was also popular in Russia, because it's almost like he's big in Ohio, but he hasn't made it in New York yet, right? It's like, people in New York business, show business say, oh, it's a second-class citizen, the kid from Ohio. It's almost like that with Ukraine and Russia, right? Like, you can go to Russia, and you talk about this in the book, but, well, you're still Ukrainian, right? The Russians are still going to come before you. You're still kind of a second-class citizen. For him to break through it all into Russia, what did highlight just how good he was at what he did.
Yeah, I mean, that was, the period of his career we're talking about now is kind of the early 2000s. Russia was his target audience. It was the biggest market in the Russian-speaking world. All the money for producing movies and TV shows, I mean, not all of it, but by far the most, was in Moscow. If you were going to be a big star in the former Soviet space in the Russian-speaking world, you had to work with the Moscow producers, Moscow TV stations. And his audience was both in Russia and Ukraine. And his TV productions and main kind of the output of his studio were targeted to audiences in Ukraine, in Russia, and in Kazakhstan, and the Baltics, and everywhere where the Russian language is spoken. And he was successful across the board. So only in 2014, when Russia first attacked Ukraine militarily with the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass that Russia started in 2014, only then did Zelensky break off ties with the Russian market and the Russian audience, fundamentally, by cutting off his business there and kind of cutting off relations with Russian production studios. But that cost him dearly. That cost him about 85% of his revenue for his production company, because that's just how much that's the proportion of income that he was getting from Russia versus Ukraine and other countries.
And now the first time you meet him he's only a few months into his run for the presidency.
Yeah.
What was he like when you first met him? What were you expecting, and what was the person that you met?
Oh, he was a very charming guy, very charismatic, very funny, very easygoing, happy-go-lucky, optimistic, easy to be around. He struck me as the very opposite of a professional politician. He didn't grandstand or lecture. On the contrary, he would often ask me on the campaign trail, like, what do I think? What's Trump like? Or what are international leaders like? As if I have any idea. He would sort of ask advice from everybody around him because he was trying to get a handle on, this whole international politics thing, which had not been his professional zone of comfort ever before. So, yeah, he seemed naive. I had the feeling that he didn't know what he was getting himself into. He didn't have strong, detailed positions on how to resolve the endemic problems that Ukraine was facing at the time, whether it's corruption or, the war in the Donbass, these kinds of things. He had this attitude of like, yeah, we'll figure it out. And if we have trouble figuring it out, we'll hire professionals to help us. That was sort of his approach. That was the pitch that his campaign made as a political outsider. That was kind of one of the main principles, the main pillars of his campaign, that he is not a politician. He is an outsider. He's bringing in fresh blood, new blood, and his inexperience was actually an asset to him. In some ways, that mirrors the American elections in 2016, when then candidate Trump really, I think, used his outsider status as a selling point. Zelensky did the same thing in his campaign in 2019, just to demonstrate as clearly as he could to people that, I'm not like the political elites that have run this country for decades. I'm different. Yes, I'm inexperienced, but to him, that seemed like an asset.
The most interesting aspect of that presidency, where you explain how if you're running for the presidency in Ukraine, you can only have a certain amount of airtime. But Zelensky found a way around that, whereas if he has a comedy show that's basically propping him up or tearing down his opponents, he is outside of those restrictions. And I found that fascinating because, we'll talk about there's some naivety there, there's these things, but he ain't dumb.
Yeah, no, that was clever. And that was, I remember at the time, hanging out with his one of his campaign managers there, who talked to me quite frankly about that strategy. So yes, under Ukrainian law, the main television channels are supposed to give each candidate roughly equal amounts of airtime. But the law is fuzzy when it comes to, a TV celebrity, the reruns of his comedy shows, his New Year's Eve comedy specials, things like this. This is not campaigning. The lawyers that were working with the campaign basically advised him that, this is fine as long as you don't present it as campaigning. And actually, the show where I met him, the variety show that he was premiering in March 2019, and I met him backstage, he begins his opening monologue, his opening stand-up routine with "No campaigning tonight." Wink, wink. So, it was pretty shameless what they were doing. And as his campaign manager told me with also a very impish kind of smile, is that it makes their opponents go absolutely apoplectic that they do this, that they kind of bend the rules this way by beaming in Zelensky's image, his comedy, his TV shows constantly throughout the campaign. I would say in violation of the spirit of that law that tries to give, fair play to all the candidates.
And he got hit with reality right away, something that's come up, and I've seen it both in the book and other places too. I didn't realize it. I'm not a candidate that's going to be like this. I'm not part of the establishment. And one of the first things that happens is, where's he going to live? It's like, this is where the president's supposed to live, but he's like, this is too opulent. I won't want to do this. But that was kind of reality started to hit him right away, right? Where it's like, there's the way certain things are done, and you may say you want to change it, but you may not have a choice.
Yeah, that's right. That was really interesting. That transition for them was especially hard for what I would call aesthetic reasons. He was, again, promising a young, fresh-faced, bold, new visionary administration full of young people, not like these old elites. And if you spend any time in the presidential compound in Kyiv, this is where all presidents work. It's the seat of presidential power. I'd spent a lot of time there over the years. President Zelensky is the third Ukrainian president I've met and interviewed and profiled in that space, in those buildings. They're old-fashioned. They look like a kind of shabby Palace of Versailles type of vibe. A lot of heavy wooden mahogany kind of furniture with heavy drapes and golden fixtures and tapestries depicting kind of heraldic scenes of warriors and lions and hunting and so on. It looks like a estate sale of some European castle somewhere. And Zelensky and his team hated that. They hated the place. It stank to them of the old ways. The musty, old, stale air of past administrations that they had promised to clear out. So they wanted to move to a different space. They had different ideas. One of Zelensky's closest advisors at the time told me that they wanted to model it on the headquarters of Apple in Silicon Valley. Something like that, right? To build a new administration with a new building with glass and steel and open air and open plan. But hey, there were two problems. One, that's very expensive. Number two, it's not so secure. So one issue that they ran into very early on is the bunker. So underneath the presidential compound, there is a nuclear bunker, very deep beneath it, that is meant for situations of war or some other calamity where the president needs to go hide for a while. And very early in their administration, they took a tour of this facility, and they were like, "What is this for? Are you guys? What do we need this for? Like, the Cold War is over. Do we really need to maintain this underground burrow And the security guards were like, yes, sir, we do. We need this just in case there's a serious war or something like this. And there was kind of like, okay, fine. But they rolled their eyes essentially at the security guards and didn't want to work there. But eventually the accountants and the bodyguards won the argument, and President Zelensky was forced to continue working as previous presidents in that same space.
This is something that he kind of keeps butting up against, and I mean, I guess we'll just jump. What did you expect when the invasion happened? Because there was a lot of people who were like, that Russia might do it, they might not. From what you saw, the Zelensky that came out of the invasion, was that who you thought he would be when this happened, or did he surprise you?
Oh yeah, he surprised me for sure. I didn't think he had it in him. I think most Ukrainians didn't think he had it in him, according to the polls that were coming out before the invasion. Yeah, I did not expect the invasion to take the form that it did. I did not expect by any means Russia to make a kind of blitz attack against Kyiv, to start bombing Ukrainian cities, civilian neighborhoods, hospitals, churches. I mean, this was such a worst case horror scenario that I didn't expect it. And there was an interesting debate going on in the weeks before the invasion among the kind of the press corps, the journalist community that covers conflict, but also covers Russia. And there was an interesting split that I noticed at the time, and we talked about this with a lot of my colleagues, that the correspondents who are regional experts in the politics of the region, the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, they generally did not believe that this was possible. It seemed out of character and too extreme for Putin. It just seemed too extreme for the 21st century. It seemed outside the realm of the possible, honestly. To me and a lot of my colleagues, I wasn't alone in this. The ones who believed it were more my friends and colleagues who were based in Washington and getting their information from the Pentagon, the CIA, and U.S. intelligence sources. They were like, no, this is serious. And also people who just cover the military, who don't have any particular expertise in the region itself, but who know what it looks like when an invasion is about to start from satellite imagery and so on. And they were reporting and telling us privately in our kind of, over beers and so on, that like, no, guys, you're wrong. This is serious. I didn't believe it. President Zelensky didn't believe it. A lot of people didn't believe it. So, I own up to that. I've learned once again that I am not a prognosticator. I work in the present and the recent past, and I need to stick to that. I don't predict the future. I
mean, how much of the Zelensky that we saw come out post-invasion was, and this is going to sound almost like an insult, so this is not an insult at all. How much of him was, especially that first day, fake it till you make it? Put on that brave face, like it's almost like he was doing real life war improv, where it's like, this is what I have to show right now. Because you talk, there's that shock factor, but then it seems like he kind of knew what he had to project, what had to be done. Is that kind of what you saw? Yeah, that's right. I think in those early hours of the invasion, when we talked about them, he mentioned giving himself a kind of pep talk to psych himself up for this new role that he had to play as a wartime leader. And he remembered telling himself, everyone is watching, you're a symbol, you must act the way a head of state must act. And then the kind of operative point there is head of state. What is that? He had certain ideas in his mind of what a wartime head of state, commander-in-chief, needs to act like. And I think that's what all of us would do in that situation. If you imagine yourself, faced with that kind of extraordinary, horrific set of circumstances, you have to wing it. Like what kind of experience are you going to draw upon to deal with that situation? He wasn't a military commander. There were very gifted and capable generals who were handling the military aspect of things, but he had to become a symbol, as he put it to himself in those hours. He had to be a symbol of the country, of its defense, of its resilience, and that's the role he began to play. As I said earlier, I think he was, pretty uniquely prepared for it, because he had changed careers, had changed roles in life repeatedly, and made pretty dramatic changes to his persona over the years. And he began to play that role. That doesn't by any means trivialize it or suggest that it's fake. I just think that he had a certain flexibility that allowed him to do it well and do it quickly, which was essential. In the beginning of the invasion, there couldn't be any kind of dead air on the radio. The high command needed to step in and start making decisions and giving orders very quickly, and he was able to do that. Now, the cabinet around him once the invasion starts, this isn't necessarily like him. A lot of the people in his cabinet are friends of his who kind of he came up with, right? Are these people that were kind of experienced in politics and stuff like that? Or is this a whole cabinet of political novices, so to speak?
It's a mix. There were a lot of people generally in his administration and around him who came from the worlds of entertainment, show business, movie making, TV production, and that kind of thing. He brought a lot of friends with him into politics. So I think for the most part, yeah, the people around him who were the key kind of decision makers did not come from traditional statecraft, diplomacy, or military leadership by any means. The main negotiator in the early round of peace talks with the Russians, the person Zelensky chose to lead that delegation to try to reach a peace with the Russians, was his old friend, David Arachamia, who comes from the world of like tech startups. That's his professional background. His chief of staff, who was absolutely instrumental and, fielding calls from frontline generals and the White House and, was a kind of clearinghouse or a gatekeeper to Zelensky. He used to be an entertainment lawyer for Zelensky's production company before Zelensky became president. So that's his professional background. Like, a lot of them, the Speaker of the Parliament used to be a comedian, and is a good friend of Zelensky's. So, a lot of these guys, yeah, they were not, classically trained statesmen.
And for a long time, Zelensky thought if he could get in a room with Putin, he could hammer something out, right? For a good amount of time, he thought that there was a chance that he could get into a room with Putin and kind of reason with him and figure out a way out of this, right?
That was certainly the case in the beginning of his presidency in 2019. That was his main promise. And he had a very high level of confidence in his ability to break the ice with Putin, to break through Putin's armor, to strike a peace deal to end the war in eastern Ukraine. The book describes the gradual disillusionment with that and how it didn't work out as Zelensky had hoped. But it was also, I think, even more surprising to me how long after the invasion Zelensky held to this idea that, hey, maybe the atrocities that the Russian forces are committing, maybe Putin's not aware of them. Maybe he doesn't know what's really happening on the ground. Yes, he tells the troops to advance, to take this city or this region, but maybe he doesn't know, the horrors that the Russian troops inflict in carrying out those orders. I think that was a kind of benefit of the doubt that Zelensky needed to give Putin to preserve the possibility of negotiations. He still, for the first, I don't know, I'd say at least a month and a half of the invasion, he still believed that if he were to sit down with Putin and, hammer out an agreement, they could end the war peacefully and in a way that didn't amount to a capitulation for Ukraine. That was his aim, and he stuck to it longer than I think a lot of his advisors thought was realistic or reasonable.
One of the things he did in the early part of it is, martial law because of everything that was going on. And something that I think you key in on very specifically is basically clamping down on any dissent, any internal dissent within Ukraine. As you've talked about, you're allowed to say certain things, but there are other people who probably can't speak as freely because they might be seen as rebellion or helping the Russians. Did you kind of see that coming when this all happened? Were you kind of concerned when they started clamping down?
Well, I wasn't that surprised. This began, before the invasion. Zelensky took a very hard line, harder than many expected, against Russian propaganda, Russian influence, pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine before the invasion. He shut down some of their TV channels. His government pursued criminal prosecutions against members of parliament, opposition leaders who took a pro-Russian stance. And this all happened under Zelensky before the invasion, so he had a certain reputation and record of taking these steps against the opposition, not being shy about clamping down on opposition figures, political figures who he thought were damaging to the country, threats to the sovereignty of the country, its independence. And he got criticism for this, again, before the invasion, for being anti-democratic. The European Union criticized him for sacrificing freedoms of speech in the pursuit of his kind of pro-Russian opponents domestically. Once the invasion started, he had many more tools to do that, to take control of the airwaves, to control the political opposition. So when martial law is imposed, and the book looks closely at martial law what it means and what it did to Zelensky, what it gave him. It gave him essentially extraordinary powers to rule by decree. The normal functioning of parliament is put on hold. It is illegal to hold elections under martial law. And I think maybe most important for Zelensky and his team, they had something that they wanted earlier, control of the airwaves, control of television. And, the book describes in a lot of detail what's known in Ukraine as the United News Telemarathon, which is essentially, state wartime propaganda that's shown on all the main TV channels and essentially pumps out Zelensky's message of defiance, resilience to the people of Ukraine on all the main, broadcast networks. He has frustrated a lot of his own people with that approach because, you see that in the ratings for these kind of propaganda channels. A lot of people have turned them off and switched to watching Telegram, Instagram, Facebook, social media channels that the government in Ukraine does not control. But Zelensky has been very adamant that, hey, we're at war. That means we're also in an information war. And the airwaves are a weapon of information, as he calls it. And as he put it in one briefing where he was challenged on this point, he said, the weapon of information is very powerful. And at a time of war, you have to point it not at your own head, but in the direction of the enemy. So he's quite insistent that this is important, and he will not let up in the state's control of the airwaves, of television news, certainly radio, until the war is won.
It's just amazing what this information war has done with everything you're saying. I can't help but think of one of the most amazing little tidbits that started to get out and people started to believe was that Jewish president Zelensky is a neo-Nazi. What I find really interesting, and you do this throughout the book, there's a lot of things out there that people are arguing about with politics. But what I really love about your book is there was a bunch of things as I was reading, I'm like, that's where that comes from. There is something that comes from neo-Nazism that falls kind of under the Ukraine umbrella. Not Zelensky himself, who once again is Jewish, but there's a particular Ukrainian kind of military unit or area that might have had roots in that kind of radical thinking. Is that where all of that, where we hear, oh, they're all neo-Nazis down there, is that where that comes from?
I don't know. It is a Russian narrative that Russia has used in its attempts to dominate Ukraine even before these kinds of movements emerged. Even going back to the 90s, Russia has long argued that the elements of Ukrainian society, freedom fighters who sided with the Nazis during World War II, are kind of, lurking in the background and waiting to take power in Ukraine against Russia. This was a very common refrain from Russian leaders even before Putin came to power in 2000. Yeah, there were a series of groups that emerged out of the revolution of 2014 who had their roots and took a lot of their membership from neo-Nazi groups, far-right-wing kind of football hooligan groups, a certain right-wing underground that exists in a lot of European countries, a lot of countries around the world. And they were a pretty prominent force in the revolution of 2014. In Russian propaganda, they were characterized as some kind of enormous threat. Whereas in reality, they were a fairly minor faction in the revolutionary movement in 2014. So, I mean, this is kind of a long story of how that developed. It's very well documented that, in Ukraine, yes, there are military units, a few of them who have roots in the kind of far right underground. But I think at a time of full-scale war, these units, some of them, especially the Azov regiment, which does have these roots historically, they've shown such heroism in defending the country. They were the main force defending Mariupol against the Russian invasion. The heroism and the sacrifice that they've shown and the number of fighters they've lost, I think pushes to the side issues of their political ideology. I think it's fair when Ukrainians suggest that these kinds of questions are better left for peacetime. At a time of war, we have to honor the heroism and the sacrifice that these fighters are making, and questions of what kind of politics they espouse or espoused in the past are kind of not the thing that we should be have at the front of our minds right now. Russia always tries in its depictions of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian nation to kind of push these forces to the forefront as if they're very significant. Politically speaking, the far right has never had anything like electoral success in Ukraine. And as you said at the beginning of your question, President Zelensky is a Jew. So to call him a neo-Nazi is just comical. But indeed, in Russian propaganda, that is done with a lot of frequency. President Putin has said this. He's even been asked, like, how can you accuse Zelensky of being a neo-Nazi if he's Jewish? And then he said something, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something to the effect of, oh, that's just a clever strategy that the Americans have of hiding the true neo-Nazi nature of Ukrainians by putting a Jew in the presidential seat. It's just like insane stuff.
So who is Zelensky now? Who does he have around him now? Because we talked about the cabinet and who he had, but there's been a lot of changes since the invasion. Is he still the same person that you saw? I mean, and I just want to say this to people listening to this. There's two pictures in the book kind of right before the invasion and after, and just how much he's physically changed. What changes have you seen in him since the invasion?
He's gotten a lot tougher. He's developed this kind of armor that he wears that makes it somewhat less fun to be around him. It's a more difficult and demanding place to work, the presidential administration. If before, certainly in the early months of his presidency, the office there on Bankova Street was a fairly easygoing, relaxed place. There was a lot of joking. There was a lot of fun. Informality. It was quite casual. Now it's all business. The invasion has really brought out these aspects of Zelensky's character that existed before, but not in such extreme form. So workaholism, being a demanding boss. He's very tough. His sense of humor has kind of withered to the extent that he doesn't make much room in his conversations with aides and allies in the administration. He doesn't make much room for small talk, banter, jokes. It's sort of, he comes in, he hears the reports, he gives the orders, stands up, walks out. I've heard this, I've observed this. He's very much kind of focused on the mission and always thinking, what is the next thing we can do? What is the thing we can do in the next hour, the next week to bring victory a little bit closer, to demonstrate our ability to win, to break through the kind of doom and gloom that has been settling on Ukraine in recent months? That's sort of where his head's at. It's tough to see the transformation for a lot of his friends who knew him early on. They find it hard to see, including his wife, to be honest. When he turned 45 years old about a year ago, he got a message from his wife where she said, you've changed. You don't smile as much anymore. And she missed that about him because, he doesn't allow himself that kind of fun aspect of his personality. He doesn't allow it to shine through very much at a time of war.
It seems, there's a lot of things that can be said and have been said, but I don't think there's any question that he is basically sacrificing parts of himself to keep the country together. Whether or not you agree with the way he's going about it, he is all in about winning this war.
Yeah, and just the way that he pushes himself and the people around him, his stamina in terms of his travel schedule. Like I've had, little moments here and there of having to, follow him around and keep up with him while reporting and writing this book. But my God, like the staffers who have to go on all these trips with him, they complain to me in private, like, man, I'm losing my mind here. Like I haven't seen my kids in ages. Like I can't keep up. Like we don't sleep. It's one trip followed by another, on the train, on the plane, in the car, in the convoy. He doesn't stop. And he has that physical stamina. He's shown it, but it wears him down. He is tired. I heard from one of his advisors recently, he said, yeah, like you can tell if you think back to the early days of the invasion, he's not as quick with his decisions. He doesn't think as quickly. He's not as light on his feet. The fatigue is showing. And he hears from his advisors too, a lot of people who love him and care for him, man, you got to take a break, boss. Like you're pushing yourself too hard. He doesn't have a lot of patience for that. He says, like, I can't. I'm not going to do. I can't do it. I'm not going to take a break. He doesn't let himself breathe. I think that's not good. I think fundamentally, I wish he would take a break. And you get that sense, like the news cycle is constantly showing him popping up in different countries and like popping up in different parts of the war zone. And, you don't really think about how much that takes to get there, especially within Ukraine. Travel is extremely restricted and very dangerous. On the presidential train, there are no airplanes flying. He doesn't travel by helicopter because it's too dangerous. So it takes a long time. It takes a lot out of him. It takes a lot of energy, but he's still running on some kind of fumes that are keeping him going. And I'm not sure what they're made of, but he's still at it.
I mean, is the old him still there? Like, can you get a laugh out of him, or is he so laser focused that he is a completely new person with one goal and one goal only?
No, I think the old Zelensky is still in there. It shines through, but it's dimmed to an extent where it's hard to recognize. The qualities as a communicator that he had, the qualities of empathy that he had all his life. And I'm thinking in particular about when he goes to the front lines and when I traveled with him and his conversations with soldiers, people on the front, not his regular military advisors, not the officers, but kind of lower level military personnel. He really listens when he talks to them. He really takes to heart what they tell him, what their experiences are. You could see the kind of empathy and the grief that he shows on his face. And I don't think he's faking it. It's not an act because there are no cameras around when these conversations happen. It's just things that I happen to overhear or see or be present for. That's the old Zelensky, that ability to really connect with people and to internalize their pain, their stories, to listen to them. That's something that's persisted, and it's allowed him to remain human in the course of this invasion. But also, on a pragmatic side, I think it allows him to get information, to make sure that the information that he receives through his advisors, he double checks it when he talks to these people, to soldiers, to regular people on the streets. He wants to be sure that the information fed to him by his closest advisors, filtered by the presidential staff, is correct, that it matches what the experiences of his people and his soldiers have been. It's interesting to see the extent to which he questions people on the street still, and tries to get their experience, to see their emotions.
And we talked a lot about his positive aspects, and a lot of it's in the book, and I think it's fair that there's another aspect, a future aspect of him that does concern you, right? Which is, if Ukraine wins, if Ukraine can even just stop Russia from completely taking over and there is a Ukraine to exist, you seem to have a concern of who is he when peace comes, if it comes. What does Zelensky do once all of a sudden he doesn't have to be under martial law? He has to start listening to other people criticizing him. That's a concern for you, right?
It is, yeah, and I think the concern is rooted to some extent in some of his actions in the past, especially as relates to freedom of speech and his dealing with the political opposition in Ukraine. But I think more my concern is rooted in what you're more of an expert in than me. It's historical precedents. History shows that when a leader has absolute power for one reason or another, it's very difficult to part with. It's an addictive thing. And under martial law, President Zelensky has been granted legally and fully within the framework of the Ukrainian constitution extraordinary powers to rule by decree, to control the message that the television shows. And giving that up is hard for any person. Historically, there are more precedents of leaders clinging to that kind of power than giving them up. There are also precedents for the opposite. As I understand, President Truman, when at the end of World War II, gave up certain extraordinary powers that he had in the U.S. during the war, and went back to kind of democracy as usual. We'll see. I don't know. I don't know how Zelensky will deal with that kind of fraught transition. It's going to be a big test. It's going to also define his legacy. What Ukraine looks like after the war, after what I certainly hope will be its victory. That'll be a difficult transition. I think there will be tensions. There will be disagreement between the people and the leadership, between the president's office and the parliament, about when it's time to go back to normal democracy, freedom of speech, the normal functionings of parliament, and so on. And that'll be hard for the country. It'll be hard for Zelensky personally. When I've talked to him about this, he promises and he assures me, he assures everyone that this is his intention. He says it's simple. We're at war. We're under martial law. When the war ends, in our victory, we will lift martial law and I will give back all these extraordinary powers. I'm not clinging to anything, but we'll see. History favors the pessimists, I think, in this regard.
I won't ask you what you think will happen because you already said you've given up on prognostication. It's not your business anymore. My last question is, people are usually bored with history. Why should they read this book and everything? I think for this, I want to ask this question a little bit differently. Why should people still care about Ukraine? It's something it keeps getting pushed to the second page. There's other things that pop up. So, it is your book, but also just the greater question of why should we still care about Ukraine? Why should we read this book?
Well, my instinct as a journalist is always not to give my opinion, but to shift to the people I write about. So let me give you a perspective from President Zelensky. He sees this war fundamentally as an anti-imperialist war, as an attempt by a small country to break the final bonds of empire and oppression. And these are not only, physical or military bonds, but psychological questions of identity, language, to really gain sovereignty and independence. And what he argues, and I tend to agree with him insofar as I allow myself an opinion, that, as he puts it, if Russia devours us, the sun in your sky will get dimmer. Yeah, the point being that, if we really espouse these values of democracy, sovereignty, respect for human rights, then we do need to, as societies, put our money where our mouths are and step up to support these values, even when they don't directly affect us, right? Even if they seem far away. There's a certain level of hypocrisy that we as a society and we as individuals will have to live with if we turn our backs on the cause that Ukraine represents. It's a cause of freedom. It's a cause of sovereignty and independence. It's a cause of defending yourself against oppression and a genocidal aggression. So, these are questions that I think history will judge all of us harshly if we don't stand with Ukraine, because it will show that, yes, we talk a lot about values and ideas of personal freedom and sovereignty and independence. But when push comes to shove, if we don't sacrifice and sacrifice one or two of our comforts in helping that cause, then it's something that we're going to carry for a long time. I think, morally speaking, in terms of our own identities as democracies, I think those things will suffer if we allow Ukraine to fall.
Well, Simon, the book is fantastic. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
And that's it for this episode. Simon, thank you so much for coming on. The Showman, trust me, go out and get it. It's really, really, really good. Until we hear from you next time, why don't you reach out to us? Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Let us know what we're doing. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Maybe give us a rating, 5 stars, if you wouldn't mind. But until next time, stay cool, nerds.
History Nerds United.